Welcome to our Bible class. Those of you who are visitors, great to have you. We are studying the Gospel of Matthew, and let's go ahead and we'll jump in to a quick rundown of what we have studied so far. We've pointed out that the Gospel of Matthew oscillates between narrative and teaching, kind of back and forth. And so far, we've covered all the way through chapter 14. And it's been a great study for me. I hope it's been a great study for you on the other end of the podium, so to speak. This is my last class that I'm teaching with the book of Matthew. So what will end up happening is Daniel is going to continue through the whole book, but now Robert is going to jump in, and we kind of split the book in that way with Robert and me. So thank you for putting up with me, all right, and for listening to me, humoring me, and I hope that you have been built up and encouraged in these classes. So on Wednesday, I tuned in. I was out of town. I tuned in on YouTube and caught some of it, and I was able to pull enough out to, and of course I read it. But some of the main points was we remembered that we started actually in chapter 13, the end of it, where Jesus is rejected in his own hometown. You might be remembering that. He's misunderstood. They're like, isn't this the carpenter's son? Who does he think he is? Kind of a thing. And then John the Baptist is executed. And so we see Jesus is misunderstood and he's distraught, yet he still reaches out a hand of compassion and he's still patient, right? And we see the disciples, they're still lacking, right? And that's something, I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but we're in this, the fourth narrative, narrative number 4. We'll give it a name at some point. And this is a longer narrative section, chapter 14, 15, 16, 4 chapters, right? And I think Daniel's going to chunk 2 of them together on Wednesday. Today we're going to be in chapter 15. And so I just wanted to bring all the recent stuff that we were talking about on Wednesday to your mind so you can kind of link it all together, because that's one of the things we can do when we're moving at this faster pace is get a better sense of the whole book, a zoomed out look at the book. So, without any further ado, wrong button, new clicker. Let's jump into Matthew chapter 15. We'll start with just verses 1 through 20. Matthew chapter 15, verses 1 through 20. Before I start reading, you may notice at the end of 14 where Jesus is. Gennesaret. I don't know how to say that very well. It always sounds better in your head, right, when you read it. And then so last we heard that's where he is, and now we're in chapter 15. Then the Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus from Jerusalem and said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat." He answered them, "Why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? For God commanded, 'Honor your father and your mother,' and whoever reviles father and mother must surely die. But you say, if anyone tells his father or his mother, 'What you would have gained from me is given to God,' he need not honor his father. So for the sake of your tradition, you have made void the word of God. You hypocrites! Well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men.' And he called the people to him and said to them, 'Hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person.' Then the disciples came and said to him, 'Do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying?' And he answered, 'Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be rooted up. Let them alone. They are blind guides. And if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. But Peter said to him, "Explain the parable to us." And he said, "Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." All right, so we have the first thing I wanted to point out. It's as big as I could almost make it. I could have gotten rid of the title. I tried to make it big, but it's still hard to see. So Gennesaret, maybe that's how you say it. That's where Jesus last was, but we're going to assume he's still there, right? Okay, new clicker. Oh, cool. All right, so that's right here in the red. Okay, and it says that the scribes and Pharisees came from Jerusalem. They went all the way up there, right? So that's like, I looked that up. It's about 90 to 100 miles of travel. Just kind of interesting because it's like, it wasn't like, oh, well, Jesus is conveniently close, so we have some things we're going to say to him. No, they would have traveled 90 miles, and they can't just hop in a car, right? So to confront Jesus about this issue that they had, right? And I'm going to call this first section, the scribes and Pharisees return, because we already saw them in chapter, 12, right? In chapter 12, we had all those interactions, right, where the Pharisees were like with the Sabbath and accusing, and then demanding a sign. You remember all that stuff? Okay, so now they've returned, right? And so we're getting more narrative and more stuff going on. And we know that they are plotting to destroy Jesus, if you remember that from chapter 12, right? Okay, so let's see here. Whoops. Okay. So, yeah, I already said all that. Okay. Now, so the scribes and Pharisees come up to him and say, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders?" Which is this ritual washing of the hands before you eat. Okay, so it was like a kind of a tradition, right? A commandment of men, something they had come up with, a purification kind of ritual, but it was not commanded by God, but yet the religious leaders at some point decided it was important, and so that's what people did. The Jews did. And so they're like, well, why don't your disciples, they're breaking this tradition, it's disrespectful to the elders, and they're not pure because they're not washing their hands before they eat. And Jesus responds with a question for them, right? Jesus is not put on the defensive here. Why do you transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? All right. And then, Jesus pretty much explains it for us. I had this great explanation. We'll go through it, but you look at what he says. For God commanded, honor your father and your mother, which is from Exodus 20. That's the 10 Commandments, right? Okay. And then in the next chapter of Exodus, he also says, if anyone, whoever reviles father or mother must surely die, or whoever curses father or mother shall be put to death. Different translations. Anyhow, so Jesus brings these two to the table after he says, well, why do you transgress against the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition, right? And so the crux of what Jesus is getting at, is like, God's commanded that you are to care for your parents when they get old. Okay, that's what he's getting at, but it's kind of perhaps a little confusing if you don't know the details of what's going on. So I'll bring some of that to light. We see that he says, Jesus in verse 5 says, if anyone tells his father or his mother, what you would have gained from me is given to God, it's like, wait, what? Hold on, what's going on here? Well, there was this rule that had been created where someone could declare their possessions or their assets korban, or devoted to God. All right, like, I am so holy, my things are devoted to God. However, they could still use their possessions until they died. And so people were using this as a kind of a loophole, right? Okay, so I get to keep all my things, a selfish loophole. And instead of caring for their parents, they were declaring all their things korban. And so that's what Jesus is referring to in verse 5. And then he further says, it's for the sake of your tradition, you've made void the word of God. You're not honoring your parents. Okay? And then he calls them hypocrites, and he quotes Isaiah with this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, right? Okay, and so we have a pretty, the exposing of, as far as what I can tell, like, there's corruption here. This is wrong. There's something very wrong with this, right? And then Jesus, in verses 10 through 20, talks about what defiles a person, right? And what doesn't defile a person. And it all boils down to what's in the heart. And he's already talked about this somewhat before, right? When he talked about in verse, well, hold on, let me keep up with my slides here. He says what comes out of the mouth is what defiles a person. But in chapter 12, he says the mouth speaks from the abundance of the heart, when he was talking about fruit, right? You bear good fruit or bad fruit. And so the implication was that the heart is the source of what you do and what you say. And anyhow, he basically repeats that. You'll see that he says that again. There it is. What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart and defiles a person. So we have this repetition. And it's interesting, now that we're far enough in the book and I start looking ahead and looking back, we'll see a whole lot of repetition. I mean, there's a good amount of repetition. It's like, oh, Jesus already said this before. Oh, Jesus said this before. I think there's multiple reasons. Obviously we see here, like, Peter asked for an explanation. We're going to see that some of this is not sinking in so well with the disciples, right? Like, Peter's like, wait, what does this mean? He's a little slow to grasp. All the disciples seem to be. And we saw that some in the last chapter, right? Or we saw a lack of faith with the walking on the water and all that, among other things. Okay, anyhow. Okay, so, and then Jesus is saying, well, what comes out of the mouth defiles the person, but then there's also all these acts that are not just what you say, right, that defile a person. And his point is, this ritual washing of hands, that doesn't matter. That's not what, purity of hands, the external purity. So that's what we start to see. You've heard of the whitewashed tombs that the Pharisees are. We haven't seen that in the text yet. But that's what we're getting at, right? There's the externally clean. I can be that. I can appear to be very holy and righteous. And then there's the internally, what's going on there. And so Jesus is saying we need to be internally pure. Man, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here. So I gave you, I was way more detailed than I wanted. So I gave you some of the answers to my question. Perhaps there's some things that I didn't say. But what I would like to do is give you the chance to group up and to take another gander at these verses, if you'd like. And, what are, obviously I gave you the big key point, I guess. But what key points can we take out of these first 20 verses? So go ahead and group up with those people who are near to you and see if there's anything I may have missed or that you could further expound upon, and we'll share out in just a couple minutes. Thank you. of something that might be kind of similar to this? Like what could be, well, never mind. That's why you write your questions down, right? I was trying to get at applications. What might we run into where we could be, anyway, I guess I'll see what y'all have, and I'll stop my talking. Usually y'all have some great things to say. All right, we got Alex with a mic runner, and Justin. So if you have something that you'd like to share that your group discussed, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, you're up here in the front.
I don't need a mic, don't worry about it.
But for online, we'll go ahead and mic it.
Oh, okay. I think one of the keys is you're asking for real-time examples. I think we've all seen in the church at various points in our lifetime to where people will give their money to the church and the Lord's work and all that type of stuff, and then when they start having problems with their parents needing some help, they'll come to the church. With the thought process being, well, I gave the money here, so now the money can give, or now the church can give the money over here. And he's saying in this particular instance, that ain't the way it is. They're your first responsibility. So just because you're given to the Lord doesn't relieve you personally of that responsibility to your parents.
All right. Thank you.
Well, what I'm getting out of this is that it's pretty clear he's saying that mankind who profess to believe in God will many times adopt traditions to circumvent the commandments of God. And it goes in two directions. Sometimes man likes to impose additional burdens and sacrifices upon man that are unnecessary. God demands sacrifice, but he doesn't demand unnecessary sacrifice. Is make sure that that which we do for God is what he expects of us. Then on the other hand, man will adopt traditions that allow us to circumvent his law. God is love, therefore God loves everybody, and everybody is okay no matter what it is that they do. No, that's not what God is saying. I guess I'll end there rather than go to the heart, mind, and the spirit, and the heart, things proceeding out of the heart. That'd be Daniel.
Thank you, Brian. All right, Daniel?
That actually was what I was going to say. Yeah, Terry pointed out the heart as, the answer to your question. The key point in these verses being the heart being what you desire, what you want. And Beth pointed out that for the Pharisees, Jesus makes clear what they desire, what they want. It's to look good. It's to appear a certain way. I just think, I have this soapbox I'll try not to step on. Y'all have probably heard me talk about some of this, some of you more than others. But, a person who eagerly wants to please God and is conscientious about keeping God's commands, that is not a Pharisee. That has kind of become an image, a reputation in the broader religious world, that if you're concerned about keeping God's commands, that makes you a Pharisee.
Yeah.
But a passage like this just makes it so obvious, as Brian just said, the whole point of their traditions, or at least a large point of their traditions, was to not obey God's commands and instead to do the things that they wanted to do anyway. He mentions murders, adulteries, fornications, greed, all of that. But even again, as we said, on a basic level, they just wanted to look good and appear righteous, not actually be righteous in the sight of God.
Okay, thank you. All right. That's probably good for this portion. All right, well, I believe, we're going to jump into the rest of chapter 15 here, starting at verse 21. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." He answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire." And her daughter was healed instantly. Jesus went on from there and walked beside the Sea of Galilee, and he went up on the mountain and sat there. And great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they put him at his feet, and he healed them, so that the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And they glorified the God of Israel. Then Jesus called his disciples and said to him, "I have compassion on the crowd, because they have been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I am unwilling to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way." And the disciples said to him, "Where are we to get enough bread in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd?" And Jesus said to them, "How many loaves do you have?" They said, 7, and a few small fish. And directing the crowd, he sat down on the ground, and he took 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And they all ate and were satisfied, and they took up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And after sending away the crowds, he got into the boat and went to the region of Magadan. All right. So, Canaanite woman we have here at verse 21. Let's see. Here I am. Okay, so Jesus, it says he withdraws to the area of Tyre and Sidon, or Sidon, however you say it. That's outside of Israel, so to speak, although it's all Roman territory, but not usually a friendly territory, although there was that time when King Hiram of Tyre helped David, or helped with the building, providing materials. You might remember that. Interesting about this area, this is kind of an aside, but it's kind of the gateway for materials to enter the Roman Empire from Asia, so to speak, right? And so people think about it, when they think about ancient Tyre and Sidon, they think about like Phoenicia and the ships and all the goods, and anyhow. But, so he goes to that area, which is where Canaanites live, not mostly Jews, majority of non-Jews, Gentiles, I guess we could say. And there's a Canaanite woman who, well, hold on one sec. Am I in? Yeah, I'm good. And she seeks him out, right? And she's begging him. Well, first off, I'm getting sidetracked here. What kind of relationship, generally speaking, did the Canaanites have with Israel historically? Let me ask that. And is there anybody who can fill us in? If you had asked me, I would have, and I hadn't prepared for this class, I might have been like, a little foggy. You know that they settled in the, Brian, what did you say? They were enemies. That's right. Yeah, okay. And so Israel had a bunch of enemies, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Ammonites, right? There's all the surrounding areas, and the people who, some of which who were supposed to be destroyed. If you remember when we studied Judges, it was like they didn't complete, like, remember they enslaved the Canaanites? You remember that? Instead of like getting rid of them. Well, okay. So they're enemies. That's generally, this is not, Jesus is a Jew, right? A practicing Jew, okay? And he's in enemy territory. Interesting. Okay, so the Canaanite woman comes and seeks him and says, "Have mercy on me, son of David. My daughter is severely demon oppressed." Okay? So this is interesting too. So if you think about, okay, well, hold on. So Canaanites did not worship the God of Israel, right? Jehovah, right? And they were not interested in that. But this woman calls him the son of David, which shows that she knows the scriptures, right? or she knows something about the God of Israel, right? And I don't know. So the timing of this in the narrative is perfect, right? Because what did we just do? We had the Pharisees came all the way from Jerusalem, powerful men of the Jews. You're not following our traditions, right? They came out against Jesus, and now Jesus flees as normal. He withdraws. I guess that's what it usually says. Every time that he's in trouble, he withdraws. So far. And now he's in enemy territory, in Gentile land, and we have a woman who comes. And so here's the general rundown, like if we had a play-by-play. She says, help me, son of David, my demon-oppressed son. My daughter, is severely demon-oppressed. And then Jesus is silent. So then we have this play-by-play, right? This is kind of an interesting section in Scripture. It makes you scratch your head, perhaps. Jesus doesn't respond. Like, what's the normal response? Whoops, I'm trying to go backwards. It's new buttons. It used to be left and right. Now they're all in different places. Can't do it without thinking. Okay, so what's Jesus' normal response to someone who seeks him out and begs him to heal somebody? So far, what's he done? He heals them. Yeah. So this is kind of interesting. Jesus is silent. Okay, and then the disciples say, hey, send her away, right? Kind of interesting in itself. And they say, if we read the exact text, they say, she's crying out after us. And some people think like the disciples thought that she was crying. Anyway, I don't know. Either way, the disciples say, send her away. And then Jesus further says, I was sent only for the lost sheep of Israel. We know this, right? Because, that's what we've seen in the first few chapters. That's what he told the disciples to do, right? He said, don't go to the Gentiles. You remember in the sending out of the 12? Don't go to the areas where the Gentiles are, but only preach that the kingdom of heaven is at hand to the lost sheep of Israel, and cast out the demons and heal the sick and all that. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. Jesus is in Tyre and Sidon, but someone's begging him, calling him the son of David, but he says he's sent only for the lost sheep of Israel, not the Gentiles, is the implication, right? And then she pleads again for help. Lord, help me, what she says. And then Jesus says, it's not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs, which is people get all like, whoa, Jesus, how could you say that? All right, but it's just I'm not going to try to explain this for Jesus. I don't need to, okay? But what I will do is we're going to keep moving for now. We'll come back to that. Then she says, yes, Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs which fall off their master's, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs which fall off their master's table, right? And so that's the play-by-play of what's going on between Jesus and this Canaanite woman. So, and then finally, we have the end. A woman, great is your faith. All of a sudden, it's like, okay, I will heal you. Let it be as you desire. I'll heal your daughter. She's instantly healed. Okay, so what do we make of this story? All right. Jesus, here's what I'll give you. This is my job, right? Tell you what I think. It's part of it, right? Or I could just hear what you think. We have two avenues, but I'll tell you what I think. Jesus, as far as I can tell, he knows the heart. He knows the heart of men and women. We know that. He can see it. All right. And so before this back and forth starts, he knows he can see her faith. He knows it. And hold on one sec. So it's my understanding that he wanted to highlight her faith, show how strong it was in contrast to, man, I'm clicking everything. Sorry. In contrast to the Pharisees, which we just saw, right? Well, at least that's what Matthew's showing us, using it side by side, or the Holy Spirit showing us, however you want to look at that. But anyhow, so my point being, he wants us to see the strength of her faith, right? And so he tests her, right? And he says, first he doesn't say anything, right? You remember that? And then he says, oh, I'm only here for the lost sheep of Israel. You know, that's God's chosen people, the Israelites, right? But then, you know, she persists and says, Lord, help me. And further says, you know, well, even the dogs, well, and he goes further, I'm out of order. We already went over this, right? But all those tests, I think, were, you know, you wouldn't remember the story if Jesus had just healed her, right? You'd be kind of like, oh yeah, there was some Canaanite woman who said, son of David, and, you know, but now, you know, it says something about her, you know, that these things happened. It kind of makes you think, I mean, there's a lot of thoughts that go through my head, but, you know, what you do when you're encountered with various situations, they say a lot about you. And you know what I'm saying? And what's going on inside. And so, you know, there's times where you'll be tested, right? And anyhow, some thoughts worth thinking about. So we have the Gentile Canaanite who's showing great faith and humility. She's like, okay, I'm a dog, but I at least get scraps, right? And then tenacity. She doesn't give up. Persistence. We see all those traits. And that's what I pull out of this story. How much time we got? Not enough. So we're going to keep going. I'd love, if you want to tell me more about that, I'd be glad to hear it after class. Okay, so back to the map. So we were up in Tyre and Sidon here. The next thing Jesus does is he goes down to Galilee. It's important to note that in the book of Mark, it specifically says Decapolis or Decapolis, which is over here, this general area, right? And we can see there's a border. So if he was along the Sea of Galilee, he was down here on this southeastern or eastern side, which again is Gentile land, okay? And so we just had a Gentile Canaanite woman seeking after Jesus, proclaiming that he's the son of David. And now Jesus has gone to this area. And we see the same kind of thing we've seen before with the healing of the crowds. I've got to move faster. Man, I did not keep my eye on the clock. So there are a few things that are different in this account, of healings than other accounts we've seen. And one of those is that, like I said, we're in a predominantly Gentile area. So far, Jesus has only been in the predominantly Jewish area. So the inference would be that he's healing mostly Gentiles here. And it says that the crowd wondered, and I thought at first, like, what, were they just thinking? And it's like, well, that word is actually to marvel or to be amazed. And they were amazed at him. And that's the same language that we saw with the Jewish response. I'm out of my notes, but I have it written down somewhere in front of me. I'm getting all flustered because I'm running out of time. There we go. Okay. Something else that kind of just implies that he's in front of the Gentiles is the way that God is. It says the God of Israel is the language versus just God. And when Jesus did all those healings in chapter 9, you might remember, it just says God was glorified among the people. But here it says the God of Israel. So again, I think that was intentional to kind of show that now Jesus is healing Gentiles. Okay, so that's just the big point here, right? Pharisees rejected Jesus, coming down after him, accusing him, and now he's in Gentile land and he's doing his thing, and people are marveling and they're glorifying God. And the woman has amazing faith. Okay, then there's another feeding, and it's very similar, you might have noticed, to the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000, right? And so we might ask ourselves, well, why is this in here? Well, it shows us a few things. We're starting to see in Isaiah chapter 2, the mountain of the house of the Lord, all the nations flowed to it. We're starting to see the fruition of that. We're starting to see it's starting to point ahead to what happens at the end of the book. in the Great Commission, go out to all the nations, and then in the book of Acts, right? In the day, we're starting to see that this kingdom is greater than just the Jews, right? This is, I think that's what we're supposed to start seeing here in chapter 15. And we're also supposed to see, yet again, with this feeding, I mean, everybody can't help but notice the disciples like, what are we going to do? How are we going to feed all these people? And everyone's like, how could you not know? But it's just Matthew. It's interesting that Matthew wrote the book and he's illuminating what really happened, right? And it's embarrassing to a degree, right? They're not getting it, right? The disciples are just not. They don't have they're not ready yet. They're still in training, and then it's taken them a while. And we see, again, if you look at the text, Christ is motivated by compassion. That is the thing that why, the crowd was with him for 3 days, and he, okay, we'll feed them. We'll take care of them. Let's see. Okay, so a couple little differences, is like the quantities. I don't think that's really all that important, except it does clearly make sure that you know they're two different events. You could get into numerology. I don't think that's really all that fruitful myself. So Jesus breaks the bread, gives thanks, which is interesting. It's kind of similar to the Lord's Supper in a way. Might make you think of that. And then the disciples distribute, and there's 7 baskets left afterward. Okay, so I wanted to get to the big picture. How much time do I have? Oh, I thought I had way less than that. Woohoo. All right, I feel better. I'll start thinking more clearly now. It's been kind of flustered here. Okay. All right, so I do have one question about that feeding. Oh, I want to go backwards since I have 5 minutes. So since all of this has been done before, why include this feeding of the 4,000? And I may have said this already, but I can't remember. Because again, I was flustered, right? Okay, but as far as I can tell, it does 2 things. It emphasizes the compassion of Jesus, yet again. He's moved by compassion over and over again. And even in enemy territory, moved by compassion for these people. Okay? But it also, it's a different people. It's the Gentiles, right? And so it's included for that reason. Although Matthew doesn't really highlight it, but, maybe it was obvious because it talks about mountains or something, if people know the geography around Galilee or something. Anyhow, now, overview so far of what we covered in narrative number 4. Jesus in chapter 14 is misunderstood by his own people and distraught by John's death, with disciples who have much to learn, right? We see. Yet he shows compassion and patience. And then in chapter 15, as I've said multiple times, we start to see the corruption, of the Jewish leadership, and kind of some of the messed up things that were going on, and we see them coming out after him somewhat to a degree, and we see disciples who are still not getting it. Yet Jesus shows compassion on these Gentiles, and especially the woman of great faith. Okay. So, what are the big picture takeaways? Hold on 1 second. Okay. I'm going to give you the chance to raise your hand here. Is there anybody who'd like to try to sum all this up? How does all this fit together? We were just in chapter 13. We had all the parables. Now we're in 14 and 15 in this narrative. If you're zooming out, like, what's going on? What do you make of all this?
Well, if I were to make my guess, I think this goes back to the promised blessing that God gave to Abraham, that all nations would be blessed. And of course, ultimately, the intention of God was to save the world. And so what we have here, as fulfilled when the Apostle Paul spoke to the Jews, since you have rejected Christ, I'm going to the Gentiles. But this is clearly Jesus going to the Gentiles in the area of the land of Galilee. And by the way, the prophet Isaiah said that the Messiah would come to the land of the Gentiles where they will see a great light. So it's sort of a fulfillment of prophecy of here we see the Jews rejecting Christ already and Jesus turning to the Gentiles.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. Daniel?
And both of those things fit beautifully in Matthew, who began by saying Jesus was the son of Abraham, and then who has quoted Isaiah multiple times to say Jesus is fulfilling that messianic mission. You mentioned chapter 13. Chapter 13, the parables were largely about sorting. We mentioned that on Wednesday. So how someone hears the message, sorts them into a category, those who accept, those who reject. And then, these stories, the Syrophoenician woman, or the Canaanite woman, so obviously and beautifully, demonstrates what it means to humbly accept the message, while the Pharisees are a prime example of maybe even the pathway soil that's just hard-hearted, won't receive it.
Yes.
But also the sorting of those parables in 13 was, in the end, God's going to go through the net and sort, righteous from unrighteous, and maybe we're seeing the beginnings of that in these stories as well.
Yeah, thank you. So last thing I'm going to say. So I think Jesus is trying to show us who can be in this kingdom that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. We've been hearing about the kingdom. We've been learning about the kingdom. Who can be in it? And it all comes down to what's going on inside, not the externals. All right, y'all have a great lunch, and I hope to see you at the song and prayer service.